Good evening. I had one of those, as I was thinking about this event, I had one of those jarring experiences because I arrived here as a student in 1972, and I realized as I was thinking about this, that was just 6 years after Dr. King led his Chicago campaign, the Chicago Freedom Summer. And here we are marking its 50th anniversary. And so I found myself wondering, how is it that I stayed so youthful? But really, the fact is, when I arrived here, there were still reverberations of that summer. It was depicted as a failed campaign on the part of Dr. King, but the fact is it helped spawn a movement, for an independent movement within the political movement within the African American community, and really changed the nature and the dialogue the nature of dialogue in our community. And from it sprung a number of political campaigns and changes in policy that were really profound. And we are lucky enough tonight to have a number of people who are an integral part of that summer and the history of that summer to lead us in a conversation of what happened then and where we are today. But my job, as always, is not to introduce the speakers, but to introduce the introducer, which I'll do in a second. Before I do, I just want to thank our partners in this event, which took a lot of work. And by the way, I also want to thank the staff of the IOP for working so hard to put this together. The Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, Bernard Kleine. He took the incredible photos that you see arrayed around here, and they will be on display. They and others will be on display at the Center for Identity and Inclusion through next week, and I really urge you, if you haven't gone over there to take a look at them, to do so. They're incredible photos of that period in our history. At the end of our conversation tonight, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, and I will ask that you please give priority to students in the audience to ask questions. First, we have the young and the young at heart here, but we want to take care of the young first. So, here to formally introduce our guest for tonight's exchange is Paulina Torres, a first-year student from Chicago who's a member of the IOP's Leaders of Color organization.
Thank you. As a member of the Leaders of Color cohort at the Institute of Politics, it is an honor to introduce this event commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Chicago Freedom Movement. The Chicago Freedom Movement was led by civil rights activists Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend James Bevel, and Chicago teacher Al Raby. Known as the most ambitious civil rights campaign of the North, the movement consisted of marches and demands to the city of Chicago concerning a wide range of issues. This included segregation and inequalities in housing and schools. Personally, as a high school graduate from the west side of Chicago, I'm aware of the inequalities in neighborhoods and schools that still exist today in the city. Chicago is, after all, the most segregated city in the United States. While it's clear there are still issues out there that we must not ignore, I am grateful to our leaders who 50 years ago took the first steps in addressing these issues for Chicago and paved the way for so much of the activism we see today in the city. Here with us today, we have 4 panelists. We have Ms. Brenetta Howell Barrett. She is a West Side political activist and the NAACP regional director at the time of the Chicago Freedom Movement. She is also known as a journalist, community organizer, agency executive, and nonprofit board member. She currently is founder, president, and CEO of the Pathfinders Prevention and Education Fund. We also have Don Rose. Known as a legendary political consultant, he served as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s press secretary in 1966. After Dr. King announced that his freedom movement would move north, Mr. Don Rose helped bring Dr. King to Chicago. We also have Mary Lou Finley. She served as secretary to James Bevel in 1966. After becoming involved with the civil rights movement in college, she decided to go to Chicago as a West Side Christian parish volunteer during the movement. She also received her PhD in sociology here at the U of C. Last but certainly not least, we have Prexy Nesbitt. Born and raised on Chicago's West Side, he joined the Chicago Freedom Movement at the age of 22, and ever since then has served as an educator, activist, and speaker on Africa, foreign policy, and racism. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Susan Smith Richardson, editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter. And before this discussion begins, here is a video of Dr. King to bring us back to 1966. Thank you.
I make my decisions on the basis of my moral commitment, and I take my ministry very seriously. I would not say that the civil rights movement is dead. It's simply that we are moving to a new phase of the movement. For well now 12 years, we struggle to end legal segregation and all of the humiliation surrounding legal segregation. So it was a struggle for decency. It was a struggle to get rid of extremist behavior toward Negroes. Now we are in a new phase, and that is a phase where we are seeking genuine equality, where we are dealing with hard economic and social issues. And it means that the job is much more difficult. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to get a program that will force the government to put billions of dollars into ending slums. It's a wonderful thing to work and be concerned about integrating public accommodations, or integrating the public schools, which I will continue to work for with vigor and with zeal. But I've also got to be concerned about the survival of a world in which to be integrated. And these issues to me are tied together in that sense.
By moving north and by concerning itself with equality in housing and employment, the civil rights movement began to encounter increased resistance, the so-called white backlash. During these marches, King and other demonstrators were struck by bricks and bottles.
Oh, I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it.
How do you feel about this reception, sir?
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
But the march will go on anyway?
Oh, very definitely. We can't stop the march. We've been going on in a few minutes.
You feel you're in a close society, Dr. King, here in the southwest side of Chicago?
Oh, yes. It's definitely a closed society, and we're going to make it an open society.
Line up a little bit.
And we feel that we have to do it this way in order to bring the evil out into the open.
Excellent. Thank you. What an introduction and what a reminder of some powerful history here in Chicago. I want to make just one personal comment before I start talking to the panelists with their rich experience. I was in Chicago for the 40th anniversary of the Chicago Freedom Movement, and it was there that I realized this piece of history, and the book really talks about this in a powerful way, has not really been as well known as other aspects of the civil rights and the Black Power history. And so being able to both talk about what Chicago contributed and what Chicago was doing, but also how it affected the national dialogue on civil rights is really an important conversation to have. But one of the most important things, and I was talking about this earlier, that came out of that conference was being on a bus with people who participated in the Chicago Freedom Movement, and they talked about their personal stories. We often know about the big, broad history, the people whose names are well known, but we also need to learn and can benefit from learning the stories of people who may have been the foot soldiers of the movement, but not necessarily the leaders of the movement. So one of the things that the 40th anniversary provided was an opportunity to really meet with a lot of people, some of whom are on the stage, who have done that work. So I want to just say how honored I am to be here in everyone's presence. So the first big question for us really is Chicago already had a tradition of organizing, was doing a lot of work in the first place. Why was it that Dr. King and the SCLC decided to come to Chicago?
You want me to take
Yes,
that?
why don't you start, Don?
We had a very well organized civil rights movement, fundamentally around school segregation, but around a number of issues as well. We had run school boycotts. We had organized for the March on Washington in '63 and so on, under the aegis of the CCCO, the Coordinated Council of Community Organizations, which finally numbered about 54 different groups, from traditional civil rights groups to neighborhood organizations. And when we learned that Dr. King was wanting to open up a northern front, and Chicago was on his list, but we understand it was not high on his list, we brought him in for a long weekend of rallies and speeches and whatever in every black neighborhood in the city. We didn't want to have one big rally. He had already, in '64, had been to one big rally, which was just a rally. But we had him in the far south side, the farthest south side, the farthest west side. I don't know, this is to one side, talk about Chicago segregation. People know that we're the most segregated city, but I don't know if people realize that when you look at a map of Chicago, an L shape going from the south side to the west side is the largest contiguous black occupied area outside of Africa. So anyway, we were fighting that, and particularly in the schools, and I think, to make it short, I'm going to let some other people speak. It was the organization, and I think intelligence and so on, and our little successes that persuaded Dr. King that Chicago would be the best organized city to open his northern front. Andy Young wanted Harlem, but he found that in Harlem the groups were fighting each other as much as they were fighting the establishment and so on. So that's how it all began in '65.
Mm-hmm. And Brenetta, I know you were involved in some organizing. We talked a lot about this piece of the history where you had black political power organizing for political positions and trying to get more African-American candidates who were not part of the machine at the time. So you also had that kind of political organizing happening, as well as organizing around tenants' rights issues and housing issues. And you were involved in that to some extent.
That's very true. I actually think that sometimes I wore so many hats, I had to check to make sure they were falling onto the right head. One of the things, if I could back up for just a moment, that I think may have played a role in Dr. King coming to Chicago, though it was not well noted or necessarily publicized as a reason for his coming, was that in 1960, there was a movement called the March on the Conventions, and Dr. King spoke at 2 churches here in Chicago in preparation for mobilizing people to march on the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles and the Republican Convention here in Chicago. Now, these were important because thousands, literally and figuratively, thousands and thousands of people were mobilized at both churches, Liberty Baptist Church on the south side and Stone Temple Missionary Baptist Church on the west side. And it happened that my best friend was very active in the Stone Temple Church. And that was important to what was going to develop later, because here were all these thousands, some estimated 4,000 to 5,000 grassroots people who came to hear Dr. King, who in some cases had not been very politically active. But here we were talking about 2 political parties, 2 political conventions, and then when Dr. King came and spoke at Stone Temple, I think people were more revved up, more ready to be signed up for whatever tasks might be assigned to them. So from that also came the impetus to look for other allies and other ways to build coalitions to fight against the segregated housing. And it wasn't just because it was segregated, because there were also inequalities in housing related to how people were charged rent, or how they were or were not able to get mortgages. And so it was really kind of fighting against the banks, the major corporations that would not hire, and all the things that Dr. King had stood against in the South.
So I want to go to Mary Lou and ask her to talk a little more specifically about what the agenda was when you came with SCLC. If you could define a little more clearly for people what the goals of the Chicago Freedom Movement were.
Well, the goals were broad, and I guess, you know, when I'm thinking back on this, that really the core question was poverty, and the housing issues that were emerging in poor, low-income communities. That's kind of where we started. There was a lot of education for the staff. I came and I was a staff person with SCLC, and because many of the people who came, we were all in our early 20s, some were 18, so there was a lot of education for the staff on what's going on in Chicago. What are the housing conditions? What are the employment conditions? What are the other communities that are organizing already here? We had lessons on the Chicago Machine and the Mafia. So there was an attempt to help the staff, and we also did this with the staff of other organizations, of the American Friends Service Committee, there was an old Students for a Democratic Society organizing project in Uptown that was organizing primarily white people, but they were participating with us. So we were trying to begin to understand what the forces were that created slums, which was the name that we used then for these poor communities that were, as one of the young people in the community described it, places where the resources were drained out and nothing was put back in. So it kind of morphed eventually into the open housing movement, but the core work at the beginning was really around poverty issues.
Okay. And I know, Prexy, you kind of come into this from a different point, but in '65, were you here when this was happening? You're from Chicago. Were you here in town, or were you by then in Tanzania?
Thank you, Susan. I came back from being in Tanzania in roughly, I think about May of ¡66. And having been in Tanzania, coming back to Chicago, I was kind of at my wit's end to what I was going to get involved with. I had to do some kind of project because I was a student at Antioch College in Ohio, but I was just really kind of going crazy, stir crazy, and my mother said to me one day, "Why don't you go up to the church?" Which was quite a statement for her to make, because at that point I was rejecting religion quite wildly. And she said, "Dr. King is up at the church." And I said, "Martin Luther King?" "Yes." And in fact, I had integrated that church as a 4-year-old in 1948. Brenetta would remember that the West Side was all white, except there were steadily increasing numbers of African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And my mother and father rolled me into this Warren Avenue Congregational Church with a broken leg. I said to him later, if those hunkies wanted to kill me, I couldn't even have gotten away. So, but it was a great experience to meet Dr. King there at the church. I was also very impressed that the church took on having SCLC and Dr. King when no other churches would do it in Chicago, particularly the black churches. Ours was a little tiny mixed church, maybe 35, 40 members. It did stand out because it had done some other things that were noteworthy, like becoming a bilingual service on the West Side when nobody else was thinking about that kind of thing. And I was then almost immediately, Dr. King invited me to come and talk with him personally because I'd been in Tanzania, and he was very interested in starting a nonviolent movement in Rhodesia. And I had met many of the freedom fighters from Rhodesia. So that got me very involved. The other impetus was that I was in a building where, in our building on the west side, there were wonderful people who were activists, like Don would remember Faith Rich, who was one of the leading researchers on the whole issue of school segregation in Chicago. And all of these people got me stimulated to then get very involved with Dr. King, particularly working with James Orange on the Union 10 slums. And it was a fantastic experience. For me, it was just wonderful.
So you've mentioned a couple of organizations that we should talk about because they were really key to enabling this movement to kind of come about. We talked specifically, and Don, you have an interesting kind of take on this piece of history. You were saying initially people were protesting at the real estate offices, and this is really before the Chicago Freedom Movement who developed STEAM. People were protesting at real estate offices because realtors were steering black couples to one neighborhood and white couples to another.
Well, this was actually part of the program that I think Mary Lou and Bill Moyer had more or less
and you were doing these
created
test cases.
as part of the housing program, housing integration, where they did the testing. You know, a white couple comes in and they're shown an apartment in a white neighborhood. A black couple comes in and they're shown an apartment in a black neighborhood. And then another white couple comes in and they're shown in the white neighborhood, of course. And the protest was supposed to go to the Chicago Commission on Human Relations under a very phony open housing bill.
Because Chicago had an open housing law, but it wasn't it had no teeth.
It was totally toothless. It passed in around 63 or 64 after some protests. And we originally had not had marches planned. They had all these other wonderful programs, anti-poverty, the slum, the tenant union organizing, and so on. And we held a vigil outside of one of the offending real estate agencies up in the Gage Park area. And as the evening went on, as the day went on, the crowds around us became larger and larger and larger and very, very hostile. And you know, by 6 or 7, it was getting dark, and we were outnumbered 30-1 by some pretty ugly-looking folk. And Jesse Jackson and I think Jim Bevel at the time worked out an arrangement with the police that would take us out in the paddy wagons and take us back to the church where we held the Southside Church, the Southside Freedom Center. I think it was on 79th Street. And when we got there, Dr. King, who was out of town, and Al Raby, who was the co-leader of the movement, were livid that we had let the police take us instead of taking the white rioters or near rioters to jail. And it was, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I, among others, said, the only way we regain our manhood, if I may use such a term, our personhood, our dignity, is to march back to that spot. And so we planned to march for a day or two later, and that became the first of what turned out to be many marches. We got to Marquette Park, the big Marquette Park, and we were met by, all along the way, we had rocks and bottles and God knows what thrown at us, and the cops were occasionally picking up some white kid who was doing too much, driving them 2 blocks away and dropping them off. And in Marquette Park, they burned cars that had our little logo on them, and it was just a horrendous scene. And that's what started the marches. We stopped there, went back again, and planned to march again, this time with Dr. King. And that is the march where he was felled by a brick, I think you saw up here, where we saw the real ugliness of Northern racism in these neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods were always at least a mile past the ghetto line. There was always a street, like Ashland Avenue was the demarcation line. And you crossed Ashland Avenue and you were into hostile territory. And Mary Lou and Bill had set up neighborhoods that should be looked at that were A, at least a mile outside of the ghetto line, and B, of an economic level that blacks could move into. It wasn't like we were trying to move them into Wilmette. And that summer then became totally focused on the marches. There were 15, 18, 20 into all kinds of neighborhoods, the southeast side, the far northwest side, and so on and so forth. And that's how the marches began, by accident, more or less, rather than by original plan.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the Chicago Freedom Movement book talks a lot about the time and attention that went into planning, strategy, and tactics. Because I think you may see on TV, this happened and that was that. But the reality is there was a lot of organizing and a lot of thought that went into these choices to change direction and do the marches. But also there was a tremendous amount of training that was going on within the organized community. So Mary Lou, can you talk about some of the training that you went through? One of the things that kind of surprised me in the book was just how intense it was, that members of SCLC, considering that many of them, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we're not from here. We're coming in and doing something as detailed as learning the bus routes in the city so they could understand how segregation played out across the city.
Yes, I would say after Dr. King's staff arrived here in the fall, we had a retreat with about 100 staff people from different organizations. There were maybe 25 to 30 staff people that were coming with Dr. King's group. And that began this process of this kind of training. We met Tuesday and Thursday mornings for many months, for the whole morning, this whole group, trying to both learn the city and also the other part of it was that James Bevel, who was director of the project, was teaching nonviolence, because the Chicago folks that kind of came out of organizing traditions, but not so much out of the nonviolence tradition. So it was a kind of bringing the Chicago folks into the nonviolence as it had been used in the South, and the people who come from other places into the story of Chicago. So yes, and now when we teach nonviolence, we talk about the steps of a nonviolence campaign. The first one is information gathering. You have to learn the community and understand what the dynamics are. So that was a really key part of it. One of the other interesting things I thought that happened with the training was that, well, it's kind of a long story, but there was very much an interest in organizing young people, mostly men, but not all together, who were in gangs, and trying to get the gangs to declare truces with one another and join the movement and fight for the betterment of the community. And as a part of that process, there was training in nonviolence for them, and so the young people from the gangs, particularly the Blackstone Rangers, and worked a lot with the Vice Lords on the west side, were trained to be marshals, or what we now would call peacekeepers, for these marches. So they were the ones who walked along the edge of the march and tried to keep the crowd away from intruding on the march, and tried to keep the marchers nonviolent in case anybody got too upset and wanted to start throwing things themselves. So, and they kept a nonviolent discipline very well through that whole process. So Dr. King was very proud of that work. James Orange actually was central to the organizing
And
with
did a good
these
job
young
of
people.
batting down a lot of bricks and bottles that would have hit the crowd.
Yeah, they were fantastic. And, I felt like that was a really powerful part of the story for me, that these were young people that some people would have given up on. But the movement didn't give up on them, and particularly Dr. King didn't give up on them, and really was able to bring them to a place of seeing how they could be a contributing part of a really important historic moment.
Well, I think one of the things that, the history kind of tells when you look at the book or you read some other parts of this history is how deeply embedded the organizing became in the community. So you had people across class lines who were getting engaged, whether it was gang members or women who, were welfare recipients who were critical to the organizing. So it had this broad kind of class reach in the community. I kind of want to go to a bigger question. I mean, we've kind of outlined what the Chicago Freedom Movement is, but I want to kind of get to the purpose of this book. The book was written because, one, there isn't a tremendous amount of knowledge about this piece of history, but in the foreword, there are a couple of other things that were mentioned. One is really the debate over the lasting impact, the legacy. Some people would frame it, was it a success or was it a failure? But to kind of take it out of success or failure language, a point made early in the book is that you look at movements as, this continuation. Well, I'm going to look at Prexy and say this. I feel so isolated way down here, too, with this seating situation. But as the groups in the freedom struggle said, a luta continua, the struggle continues. So it seems that one of the frames in trying to in putting out this book is to really look at where the Chicago Freedom Movement and the work that came before it, as well as the work since then, is kind of a continuum of organizing for racial and economic justice, not just one piece. So that said, how do you then begin to, you still have to look at concrete things that happen. How do you begin then to measure the legacy first in Chicago, knowing that it's about building blocks, but what do you look at when you say here are some of our benchmarks that we could take back to the Chicago Freedom Movement? And this is for everybody.
I think that one of the things we have to look at that's very sad to me is that there's so little commemoration of it. There's so little monumentalization of it, if you will. I think the other day I was thinking about both the Chicago Freedom Movement, but also the Black Panther Party as well. And if you take both of those movements that had extraordinary moments in it, one of those moments was Marquette Park. And I think, I understand there's going to be a big program very soon and the erection of a real monument to mark Marquette Park. But I think the other thing that really needs to be done is that to mark it in the minds of Chicagoans, to mark the significance of it as having been, I think that whole summer, in fact, was a moment of real achievement that we should be very proud of and should talk about as marking real movement of this city against this reputation deserved of being one of the most racist places in the world. I think of all those people who marched with me in those marches, many of them are still doing marches. Many of them are still doing wonderful work. I think of a whole group of nuns that came from the old Mundelein College up on the north side, who are still doing wonderful, wonderful work. I think of Danny Davis's monument, his drawing on his building on the west side, which is the only marker of the killing of Fred Hampton from another stage in that continuum. There has been no other way of marking this history that is so critical when it ties in to the efforts being done by young people, groups like Black Lives Matter and everybody else today, so that they have a sense that they aren't doing this just out of the cold, but they're continuing a train that's been moving and moving and moving. And one day we're going to really see some real utter change in the city.
I know we had talked to Don and both Brenetta and Don in kind of looking at how the movement went from the community organizing, and then you felt like many things got directed into electing people to office, and that you could look at the increase in the election, say through the 80s, take it through Harold Washington, but also before Harold Washington, looking at a number of African American politicians in particular who got elected who were against the machine, and that you could count that as something that was happening before the Chicago Freedom Movement, but certainly was, given more impetus because of the movement. So I don't know, Brenetta, both you and Don may want to talk about how you think the movement actually led to an election of more independent African American politicians. And also, was there a line between that and Harold Washington, and then, as Don said in one piece, all the way to President Obama?
I think there were many lines and connections that in some cases were quite evident, in others were a little bit submerged and perhaps not so evident. But if I stop and look at the legacy of the Chicago Freedom Movement, I think one significant part of that legacy had to be the ability and the perhaps the willingness of the formal structure that comprised the Chicago Freedom Movement to itself accept legacies that surrounded it totally. And these were the small organizations from the block clubs on the West Side to the little organizations that sometimes didn't even have a name and didn't have elected officers, but they were functioning. It might have been for a local or community beautification program, or they just wanted to kick an elected official's butt for one reason or another. But there was so much going on that these, the subtle disposition of these pieces of various legacies that were inherited by the Chicago Freedom Movement, I think helped to make it stronger and more acceptable, actually, to a broad range of people. And I wanted to comment about something I observed very often that related to how people were able to work with the Chicago Freedom Movement and yet did not totally subscribe to its philosophy of nonviolence. I mean, there are people, some around my age, who are still here now, today, who said they were willing to go to hell and back to fight for various civil rights and civil liberties issues. But they swore in the next breath that if anybody started coming at them with whatever, oh yes, they were going to take them out, they were going to defend themselves. So I think one of the beauties about the CFM and its legacy had to do with the fact that even the people who said, I'm not swearing to be a nonviolent participant, but I do swear to fight for what you're proposing and what you stand for. So many of these were also some of the gang members. I know personally I worked with members of the conservative vice lords on the West Side, and in fact, my family wound up adopting one who was very well known because of his tremendous resemblance, you might remember, to Muhammad Ali. That was Teddy Williams, yes. And so that was both a burden and a tremendous asset for him because he always got attention. And he was someone who was a high school dropout, and it just happened that an agency I was with was able to hire him as part of a neighborhood youth corps program and introduced him to someone who got him to finish his GED, and he still swore by the movement, was an active member of CORE, but was not buying that nonviolent stuff, as he put it. But after getting involved with CORE and showing up at important events sponsored by the Chicago Freedom Movement, and of course involving CCCO, he decided that maybe he did need a little more education. So we were able to get him involved, enrolled at Northeastern Illinois University. And he had a chance to go to London for a while to study, came back, and during an episode with me in a campaign I actually served as candidate for, didn't succeed as the congressional candidate, but we met Walter Walker, who was a vice president out here at the University of Chicago, and he was way out of the district where I was running, but he wanted to do some fundraising. So we brought Teddy to Walter Walker's, and he said, well, Guy, what are you planning to do with your life? And he knew Teddy was involved with Chicago Freedom Movement activity. He said, well, why don't you come and see me at my office? Long story short, Teddy got enrolled at the University of Chicago and got a master's degree, wound up being an official of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, just retired. But that was one story. And also he was rather symbolic of some of the people who were referred to as gang members, but others as well, historians and all kinds of community leaders who said they wanted to be part of this movement, but weren't willing to swear to the nonviolent philosophy.
Now, that's a really interesting point, because, well, I want Mary Lou to kind of weigh in a little bit about the impact, and then I want to talk about this issue, because you had a broad group of people you were bringing together who could have disagreed about a number of things, and I want to talk about how the coalition got held together. But before we talk about that, Mary Lou, just in kind of talking about the lasting impact and how you would measure the impact of CFM.
Well, I would say there were just so many dimensions of it. This discussion about the impact on the long-term political situation in Chicago, Don, Rose has addressed, and Brenetta. But I want to talk about the tenant unions, because that's not something that's very well known at all. It's not even mentioned in a lot of the history books about it. And that's actually what the staff was trying to do, was organize tenant unions. They were quite successful, although, you know, we were all young. Nothing seemed to go as fast as we thought it should. People came back upset because only 3 people showed up at their meeting, and they thought, this is never going to work. But nonetheless, they did get a whole number of buildings organized on the west side. And we eventually got a collective bargaining agreement. We're working with some labor lawyers, and they said, well, that's what you need, a collective bargaining agreement between the tenants and the landlords, where the landlord makes some commitments, and the tenants also make some commitments. So that happened. The agreement was on July 13th of 1966. So it was right while we were planning the open housing marches. It didn't even get a lot of attention even from us at that point, because we were really busy dealing with the marches. But it turned out that the idea caught on in other parts of Chicago. Pretty soon, there were 45 tenant unions all over Chicago. After that, there were tenant unions in 30 different cities around the country. Chicago and New York, which also had some tenant organizing, called a meeting here in Chicago. They formed a national tenants organization. And by 1972, now this is like, what, 5-6 years after the movement, landlord-tenant law began to change all around the country. Because back in those days, landlord-tenant law was, tenants didn't have any rights. You paid your rent, and if you didn't pay your rent, you got evicted. But as all of this evolved, what we were really looking for was to say, well, if the building is falling apart, and there were just horrible conditions in many of these buildings, including lead poisoning and for the children, which was happening. I want to speak about that in a minute too. But that the conditions were terrible, and part of what we wanted was to say, if the toilet doesn't work, you can call the plumber, get it fixed, and deduct the amount of money you paid the plumber from the rent. And it took a long time for the law to change to allow that. took until the 70s. By that time, all of us who'd been organizing tenant unions were long gone doing other things, and nobody really even quite noticed. So it wasn't really until we started to put this book together that we began to trace out that story and see how much of it blew out of the Chicago Freedom Movement and out of Chicago. I mean, Chicago had some history of tenant organizing already, so it built on that. So that's just one piece of the legacy that I think isn't known at all. With the open housing marches, we were trying to get a federal open housing law. After the Voting Rights Act had passed, the Civil Rights Act was passed, there was a Civil Rights Act that would have prohibited discrimination in housing that was in Congress. It did not get passed that summer. But 2 years later, 1 week after Martin Luther King was assassinated, that bill passed Congress. It was signed by Lyndon Johnson. So, and that's always a hard part of the story for me to tell, because I feel like it was Martin Luther King's assassination that really got that bill through Congress, and what a price, you know. But it is a legacy. And so when people wanted to do something for Martin Luther King, well, what came to mind was the open housing issue that he had been working on 2 years before. So there's a nice piece in the book by Len Rabinowitz, who's a law professor, who traces that story and links it back to the Chicago Freedom Movement. So that's another piece of the legacy that isn't always connected. We also did a piece on the lead poisoning campaign that started slightly before the Chicago Freedom Movement with Bernard Lafayette and the American Friends Service Committee people on the West Side. You know, this was a huge issue, particularly with small children exposed to lead paint, and they were getting very, very sick, and some died. It was routine. There were a number of, maybe 100 children who died in a year in Chicago from lead poisoning. It was horrendous. And when the movement, really they were organizing around the tenant unions, but then they discovered these sick children and decided they had to do something about that. And so they got a group of high school students together to do a kind of, they figured out, they're working with some scientists, it was like a urine test you could do. So they got the high school students to collect urine samples from the preschool children in the neighborhood, screen them for lead poisoning, and get the ones who were sick to the hospital before the lead poisoning had got so bad that they were so desperately ill that they may not get well again. As you may probably know, lead poisoning can cause mental retardation and all kinds of things if left untreated that are not reversible. So it was really important to get people there early. So that was a campaign which used a different kind of nonviolent tactics. I think of it as like what Gandhi would have called a constructive program, where you're not protesting exactly, you're doing the work that needs to get done, and other people look and say, oh, well, that's interesting. But what came out of that campaign on the West Side, first of all, Mayor Daley got really interested, and so he put it in the anti-poverty program. Chicago had the first mass lead poisoning screening in the whole country. And then a group called the Young Lords, Puerto Rican gang in Chicago, had some cohorts in New York, the New York Young Lords. They knew about this because of their Chicago contingent. And they basically got New York City to do the second mass screening for lead poisoning in the country. So here, what started as this small project with some local people on the west side of Chicago suddenly mushroomed. This is before the public health people were paying all that much attention. They weren't doing much with it until the early 70s, but after all of this, they began to pay attention. So those are just some of the legacies that are not very well known. I also just want to mention Jesse Jackson's work with Operation Breadbasket, which is still happening as the Rainbow Push Coalition. And the effort to deal with poverty and with economic justice issues was really housed in the Operation Breadbasket project, which that project it's more well known, but what they did was tell companies, particularly they did milk companies, Coca-Cola companies where there's a lot of consumption, that they needed to hire African Americans at somewhere levels above the janitor. And if they wouldn't do that, if they wouldn't respect the people in the community, the people would not buy their products. And so there were a number of selective buying campaigns, they called, that began to open up job opportunities in a whole set of industries in Chicago. So that was and it was a very successful effort to deal with the economic justice issues at that time, which is not to say that we dealt with them now. We have another whole layer of problems on top of that. But nonetheless, that in terms of the aspects of the movement that left a legacy in Chicago, I would say those are some key ones. And it really had some national implications, too.
Yeah, there's an interesting kind of post note to some of this, and this is laid out in the book. There is a story about the Contract Buyers League, and this is the case of the African American homeowners basically having to sign contracts that locked in, as part of a blockbusting scheme, that locked them into not being able to get equity in the homes until, so many years had passed. So they were stuck with these contracts, didn't have equity in the houses, and if you missed the payments, you could lose your house. But, I found it in just talking about taking a story forward. If anyone read the piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic more than a year ago, he actually interviews a gentleman by the name of Clyde Ross, who, as you talked about in your chapter in this book, Mary Lou, in talking about housing, he became active around the Contract Buyers League, which he says in the book very much the momentum for that movement was very much inspired by a lot of the issues that took place during the Chicago Freedom Movement. And talking about the continuation of the problems, years later, we ended up writing a story about how he and many African Americans on the West Side in some of the same communities where you were doing this work, where all of you were doing the work, became targets of reverse mortgage scams. So the arc of his story and the continuing work around housing and economic discrimination is just captured in what Clyde Ross went through.
Yep.
Yeah.
I want to just bring up a little bit of the political continuity as well. We had always had an independent political movement against the old daily machine. When Dr. King, we elected an alderman here, an alderman there, or something like that. When Dr. King was in '66, we elected for the first time 2 black independent state senators. One of them was in Hyde Park, the district that encompassed Hyde Park, South Shore, and South Chicago. A fellow named Richard Newhouse, who came out of an Ivy League school, was very well dressed, very well spoken, and many of us thought might become the first black president of the United States. Well, that didn't happen with him. Dick served for some years. His place was then taken by a very progressive woman. And then when she retired, a young man who was very well dressed with an Ivy League background and wore a nice suit, took that same seat that was created during the King era and became the state senator named, a funny name, like Barack Obama. And
yeah, I've heard of
that, that's just all part of a chain. This is, history is a chain of events. And it doesn't go in a straight line, it goes a lot of zigzags. But had Dick Newhouse not broken the color line, we might not have had this other fellow. Just one of those things.
I think the other thing, though, it has to be pointed out is that the machine on the West Side particularly was a very formidable foe. And there was an independent black alderman, Brenetta and I were talking about this just the other day, by the name of Ben Lewis. And I remember one of the things that most impressed me as I finished high school was that as he got elected, a week later he was shot to death in his office on the West Side, and it remains one of the unsolved murders here in the city of Chicago.
I just wanted to add that also, and I hate to hearken too far back on this historical trek, but there was a group, the Chicago League of Negro Voters. Again, one of those groups you will probably hear little or nothing about. But this was a small group of independent and progressive thinking men and women. It started out being an all-men's group, and then some women were added. But they had the nerve to run the first African-American for Chicago city clerk. That was attorney Lemuel Bentley, who polled some 60,000 votes, and the campaign was 1959/60. But this started making that group feel that there was some promise, some hope for other candidates, and so they began to pursue that. Now, a few years later came protest at the polls in 1963, and this was following the failed election campaign of a West Side businessman, Robert Biggs, who owned Biggs and Biggs Funeral Parlor. But Robert Biggs had some money, which was always one of the things that independent campaigns needed and looked for. And he had facilities. He owned more than one funeral parlor. So there were places for meetings and developing campaign strategy. And that group had the nerve, again, to run its own candidates. And so, again, I don't know how this thing with funeral parlors developed, but A.A. Sammy Rayner, who was another owner of Southside funeral parlors, and then they did add one on the West Side, but Sammy Rayner, a woman named Chloe Bryant, and I were fielded as congressional candidates by protest at the polls. Sammy Rayner in the 1st Congressional District. I was representing as a candidate the 6th Congressional District, and then Chloe Bryant, who lived in Cabrini Green Housing Development, was to represent the 9th District. And again, to just talk about training and how important all of us were allied with and attended meetings as they developed with people from SCLC, Triple CO, and the umbrella Chicago Freedom Movement. And so it meant that while we had to learn a lot about the nuts and bolts of running congressional and other types of political campaigns, and how to be candidates, as a matter of fact, because strange things happened. We were threatened in a lot of ways, and we still had to show up and to do those things that were expected of candidates. And Richard Newhouse, there were people like retired appellate court justice William Cousins, former Congressman Gus Savage. I could go on, the list is quite long, but people who started out and supported the Chicago Freedom Movement and supported protest at the polls, which was in fact a precinct-driven organization, were those who in some cases wound up holding elective office and who were in a position to sponsor other campaigns. And let me just quickly throw in what I thought was very important, and that was the weight of the black press, where you could have independent publishers who weren't afraid they might offend advertisers, but who would still editorialize and talk about the worth of this movement and the benefits local communities could gain from affiliating in whatever form was possible.
The base of these movements that elected these aldermen and sometimes failed candidates were people whose consciousness was being raised by all of these little meetings that Brenetta had been talking about, and that we were organizing other things about. And you know, Dr. King's presence was a huge consciousness raiser, and the people who wound up voting for the independents were people who were previously very dependent on the old daily machine. And had it not been for the kinds of door-to-door organizing and block-to-block groups that received one or another kind of training for civil rights organizing, became the base of what was eventually a massive independent movement that elected Harold Washington in 1987. It all came out of that. Many of the people who were elected were in fact movement people. Bill Cousins, who she spoke of, was one of the first 2 black independent aldermen. He later became a judge and so on and so forth. He began as a delegate to the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations from his local neighborhood.
This is a good transition point to kind of talk about what's happening now, because you're talking about the importance of this organizing. And you look back at this history, and for the young folks who are here, especially who may be organizing around issues now, what are the parallels we can draw? And what lessons can they learn from the organizing work that was done then and apply it to the issues that they're dealing with today? I'm specifically, and kind of Prexy had mentioned this in passing, you have the Black Lives Matter. You've got people who are organizing in this community around policing issues, but also increasingly too trying to figure out how do you take that energy from that kind of grassroots organizing and direct it toward, in some cases, electoral politics. So coming back to the bigger question is, what are some of these lessons that maybe could apply to the organizing work that's being done today? What are your thoughts on that? Well, let's start with you, Prexy.
Well, I think one of the insights from this is that there's been this tremendous history of organizing here in Chicago, that the younger brothers and sisters organizing today would do very well to know much better, and also to realize more, I think, that there are many of these older generation of folk, I hate to say I'm in that group now, but who would be very easily turned to support them in things that the initiatives that they're taking up, some of which seem to have a very long and lasting and pernicious character, like policing in the city of Chicago, which we have been battling on for many years.
I sometimes wonder what it would have been like if we had the internet and social media instead of typewriters and mimeograph machines.
We'd have saved a lot of time.
Yeah, it would have been. And none of the ink stains. I came along at the tail end of all that stuff, so yeah. But,
you know, one of the things I think about, before I say that, I want to just say, I spoke about the lead poisoning campaign earlier, and Sherry Bevel, who wrote that chapter in our book, is here. So, yes. Sherry, thank you for that work, and you can see that if you check it out. And we also have Helen Williams is joining us. Her late husband, Cale Williams, was the head of the American Friends Service Committee in those days, which played an incredible role in providing staff people for the movement. And Cale supported all these people. Bernard Lafayette who was one of those people, would say, whatever he wanted to do, Cale, let him do. And he did all kinds of amazing organizing as part of this. So that role, and we have a lovely piece by him in the book where he says, well, we as Quakers can't just sit around and say nonviolence is the way to do it. Go to it, Dr. King. We've got to be there on the front lines as well. And he was there himself personally, and he supported his organization to contribute a lot to the movement. So those are some little pieces.
Thank you.
And I guess that's, in a sense, what we can learn. Those are some of the invisible parts of the movement. You know, we don't think of American Friends Service Committee, for instance, as a kind of critical piece, but it actually played an important role in the groundwork for the movement. And I guess one of the lessons for me that I would want to say is nonviolence works. And that's, even if it's only strategic nonviolence, that is, if you go along with it, not necessarily because you're committed to nonviolence as a way of life, but that you're willing to act in a nonviolent way in a particular context. That a lot of people are there, not as Martin Luther King was a principled nonviolence person who this was a way of life for him. But you don't have to take that position in order to use nonviolence in a useful way. And the reason I want to make a point of that is because with the rise of Black Power, there were the year after the Chicago movement were the big riots in Detroit and Newark. There was a lot of thinking then at the time that, well, nonviolence doesn't work, we have to do something else. But it actually in Chicago worked exactly. the campaigns, the open housing marches, you heard Dr. King say, what you have to do with nonviolence is bring the evil out into the open. You have to let people see it, because the city of Chicago was saying, well, we have an open housing law, what's the problem here? There was a real huge denial that there was a problem. So you have the nonviolence tactics and strategies can bring the problem out into the open so that people have to face it, and then you can begin to deal with it. So that was one of the ways in which it worked. One of the other ways in which it worked was the lead poisoning campaign was an example of constructive program, which is another dimension of nonviolence that isn't always perceived by people who are at a distance from it. And along with that, just to say that marches are the most visible part of a nonviolent strategy, but they're not the only thing. You know, that Jesse Jackson's selective buying campaigns was a nonviolent action. The rent strikes that we did in the tenant union organizing was another form of nonviolent direct action. So as you get into it, you can begin to see that there's actually a lot of strategies and tactics that you have at your fingertips when you begin to work with all of this. And that part of you were raising the question earlier, as how do you decide which is the right tactic and strategy at a particular point? I don't know how to answer that except to say training, thinking about it, learning from other people, reading about other movements, trying to get a sense of what your options are, when it's time to escalate, when it's time to back down. There's a lot of wisdom in the old stories about that, and some failures too. So, and the other thing I want to say in terms of what can we learn from it is the importance of, I'm just going to say multiracial coalitions. I'm not sure quite what the right language would be right now. But you know, we began to do that in those days. We were working with, I mentioned the group in Uptown. There were some Puerto Rican communities that we were organizing. That was a shift from the civil rights movement in the South, which was very much about discrimination against African Americans. So, but in Chicago, building these multiracial coalitions kind of began in I would say we didn't get all that far in 1965 and 66, but the Black Panthers carried that on further.
And Harold's campaign.
And Harold's campaign built on that. So that Chicago really pioneered, in a sense, how to bring in progressive white people along with a multiracial coalition of various kinds and build a change on the basis of that. So I think that's another lesson.
I want to come back to that, but for a second I want to stop and let's open it up for questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, thanks for all the great conversation that just came back in the Civil Rights Museum, and this is a great tag along to that. The question I have is, as you look at the 50 years since the Chicago Freedom Movement, what do you see as the biggest shortcomings that we contemporaries now have done to not progress that thought further? And finally, what needs to happen moving forward?
Anyone want to start?
Well, the schools are now 90% minority and will never be, quote, integrated, which was our goal when the schools were 40 to 50% minority. Chicago is actually no longer the most segregated city in America, but it's only by fractions of a point on the scales that they do it. Housing segregation remains. Schools are miserable. Inequality is probably now the most overused word in politics or sociology. So one can look back and say, you know, the more things didn't change, the more things didn't change.
I think another one that is very much upon us is the city leadership we have. And I think that the fact that we have the current leadership, and I use that word with my tongue biting it very hard, is, I think, a function of the failure to get really strong multiracial groupings that went on, despite the whole fact of the non-revelation that came about because it took so long for the police to be revealed for their role with McDonald's death. Despite that, I think that the failure of us to elect a progressive candidate in the form of Chuy Garcia was a function of the failure to build enough multiracial formations and normalize multiracial work in this city. Even today, I can't count the number of events that I go to that are either all black or all white, and I'm the only one that makes the difference. And this amongst people who are allegedly progressive. And I think that we know what a difference it can make, and it was measured in the retiring of Anita Alvarez. When you do get a clear understanding of who the enemy is. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, I'm very grateful for the years that I worked with the South African struggles and the Mozambican struggles, because I think those movements had a much better sense of identifying the real enemy as opposed to these superficial manifestations like just white people. But who is the real enemy? What's the structural source of the real problem?
Well, you know, to follow up on that point, because we've kind of been dancing around this, and the importance of multiracial coalition is, you know, all over this book, and it's all over the Chicago Freedom Movement. But what you're saying is then that that's not there at the same level now. So I guess, you know, the obvious follow-up question is why you think that has happened. What is different that you don't have that same kind of multiracial or sustainable? Because, I mean, you've pointed out a couple of cases where people across class and racial lines have come together. If you look at how Alvarez ended up being put out of office, this was not one place, but many places. But what do you think has changed that's more challenging now?
I think that, and I don't want to by myself answer this, but
I mean, other folks
I think that one of the things that
know.
I just want to comment on is racism has become an insidious formation, particularly in the North. It's a question of how do you lift the scab so that you can really get to the forces that make for racism.
I think that there are several layers of evil that exist that keep multi-racial ethnic coalitions from occurring and being successful in fighting what most people would generally agree are the kinds of institutional problems that should be fought. One of them, I think, has to do with a severe and, to use your word, insidious and conscious level of, and I have to say evil again, that's perpetrated against young black people. And this is something that results in very low self-esteem, almost hatred in some, self-hatred in some cases, and not seeing blacks as winners, you know, as losers, as the people who can easily be walked on and wiped off the map, knocked off any pedestal that someone, including themselves or their own families, might choose to put them on. In the area that I've been spending almost the last 20 years of my life working on, HIV and AIDS prevention, this has come to be one of the most widely accepted and known risk factors that the people who are going to engage in the kind of risky behavior without thinking, and of course this doesn't only apply to whites, but we see it as being much more perverse among young blacks, that very often they will take these risks and know that there is no cure for AIDS, that, you know, things may look a little better and the horizon seems to be a little brighter, but you're going to suffer if you wind up becoming infected and have not a very good quality of life. And so one of the other words that struck me was somebody, I think maybe it was Don, talking about delegate, use the word delegate. And we think of that often in terms of delegating or assigning responsibility or tasks to other people. Well, there was another movement that had to do with delegates that was very important in Chicago, and this was successful because of a multiracial ethnic coalition. And some called it the Singer-Jackson movement, do you remember, Don? And others called it the Chicago Reform. It had all kinds of names, but this was a movement of independent and progressive-minded people from across the city of Chicago who were determined that in 1972 that there'd be more young people at the Democratic National Convention, there'd be more people of color at the Democratic National Convention, more women, and I'm telling you, that was a really tough, hard fight. We had to raise our own money. I wound up being the only Shirley Chisholm delegate from the whole state of Illinois.
Oh, that's in
at that,
1972.
in 1972.
Right in Miami.
Right. And I tell you, I had to fight some local civil rights leaders in order to maintain that position until the balloting was at the right point.
So I'm going to hold that story for a second because I realized I jumped in and I want people to have a chance to ask any other questions. Do we have some over here? Yes.
Hello. So my family immigrated to the United States, and one question that has been on my mind for the majority of my life is how do we strive for integration without assimilation?
Great question. How do we strive for integration without assimilation? Who wants to?
You know, I think, if I may just, have you read Jimmy Baldwin? James Baldwin has this incredible essay called The Price of the Ticket. I think it ought to be required reading for everybody in this country. And I don't know, Toni Morrison has sort of said that Ta-Nehisi Coates is the next James Baldwin. I can't quite figure that out because...
I'm not going to say anything, but there's nobody like James Baldwin. That's my only comment.
And the piece
I'm proud to say he was an old friend of mine in Paris.
No, I know. You knew him in Paris and Richard Wright. So you have a whole nother life story.
But I hope this, my sister, I hope you read that because I think it really answers that question about how do you get beyond a system that says the price of the ticket is to oppress black people, to move in on black people and see them as the bottom of the heap. I just heard a comment from a Republican advisor for Trump the other day on NPR. I don't know if you all heard this. I just was in shock. It was something to the effect of the reason Trump is so popular right now in this country is because of the will of so many to want to get the raccoons out of power. Did anybody else hear that? It was on NPR this couple weeks ago. Just raccoons out of the basement. That's right. Yeah, raccoons out of the basement.
Look, apart from the birtherism, Trump's continued attack on political correctness is nothing more than an attack on liberalism and African Americans. Most of what we call political correctness is showing some respect for people on the of other colors, of other genders, and so on. And his attack on political correctness is pure racism, as pure as his birtherism was.
You know, and I'm wondering, though, I'm trying to come back to the essence of the young woman's question, because I'm hearing two things here. There's, you know, the question of, and, you know, what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes or an hour, is this question of, you know, removing these barriers where you are not having to deal with this intense racial segregation that puts you in a position of being a second-class citizen. She's talking about this question of how do you, and tell me if I'm correct, live with people who may not be from your same background without losing your own cultural identity? Is that, in essence, your question?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you know, so I guess if we speak more specifically to the integration part, I mean, I'm not here to answer the questions, but to pose them. But in just kind of trying to speak more directly to her question on the integration side, how do you do that? And then still in a society where we are being told 100% American doesn't look like her, may not look like me. So how do you both have integration, which we know has a number of economic benefits to it, as well as just the whole question of people having choice and opportunity and being treated equally, while at the same recognizing that this is a country of people who are from all backgrounds. So that I think is kind of what I'm hearing in this question.
I think diversity has to be posited and it's not posited in this country. I think one of those things is language. We are, I think, one of the worst countries in the world in terms of acquiring languages and of seeing the value of knowing many languages and many cultures. I think that there has to be a very serious reconfiguring of schools and education in this country to have everybody learn everybody's different histories and backgrounds. Black history shouldn't just be for black people. The history of Greek immigration to this country shouldn't just be for Greek people. As a product of the old Hull House on the west side of Chicago, that was a great place for positing different cultures and asserting all of them as having validity and no one that had supremacy. And I think that's one of the things that James Baldwin would have applauded in a moment.
I think, could I just add
yes, and then I'll go to your question.
Okay, just very quickly, I think that the level or institution of respect, I mean, Aretha was right when she said RESPECT, and underscore that word so that it starts with people who are interested in being integrated, or at least respecting diversity without the negative sides of assimilation. But respect is such an important word. And I think even educational institutions can contribute towards the developing of interracial ethnic respect by internships that are provided for college students, for neighborhood programs, and those who live in suburbia may also think about some of the customs they have that tend to attract people from other communities, and whether people who come to those community celebrations are welcome or how they're treated when they get there. But young people, I think, are always looking for new experiences, and sometimes adults just aren't very creative about how and when and where they provide those opportunities.
So I'm going to go to the question back here. Thanks.
I see the three biggest challenges today as we have to work harder for the same basic needs. There's more information out there than ever before. So, you know, the reason Trump's popular is because people are uninformed. That's really where you have to look. And third, we can have marches, but no one's outside. People don't spend their time together outside in their communities. So I'm feeling I'm hoping you can infuse me with some optimism with your experience.
Want to take our last question? Ooh. Mary Lou?
Well, what was the first part you said again? Yeah. And people don't have, yeah.
So you can't, how do you decide who to trust, who to believe?
Yeah. Well, I want to address the first part of what you said was you have to work harder for not having and still don't have quite enough. And Don mentioned that earlier, the inequality has gotten worse. And I feel like we have to, there was a change in the language around economic issues. Martin Luther King talked about it as an issue of justice. And starting with Ronald Reagan, there was a massive effort to remove from the public dialogue the question of economic justice and to start blaming people who aren't having enough to say there's something wrong with them. You know, Reagan had a whole long list of things. And I think one of the things we did not do is push back hard enough about that and bring it up and say, no, this is not a matter of somebody who's lazy or whatever the rhetoric. It's about what's the structure of the economy, how do we divide the wealth that our country creates amongst ourselves, and how we decide to do that is an issue of justice. And so I feel like Martin Luther King's rhetoric from that era is actually really relevant, and we sort of need it because we've lost it for the last 30 years. And so I've been trying to go back through some of it and find some of those things, because once we began to frame it as a matter of justice, to me that's part of where the hope comes from. Because then we can begin to say, you know, we really care about doing things right. We really care about one another. It's that caring about one another and about caring about justice that the public dialogue has tried to squash, you know. And so we can't let it be squashed. We need to bring it back up again. And that for me is one of the ways we can begin to hope again. And you know, the other thing I want to say is that in working on this book, and that movements are the way things change. And that you don't always win immediately. That's another part of the lesson. You'd have to you plug away at things for a long time, and then suddenly there's a burst of activity, and something seems to come out of nowhere where you actually win. If you look at what's happened around LGBT issues over the last few years, that started back in 1969 with the Stonewall events in New York City. It took a long time, but suddenly changes came really fast. And so, and what we need to understand is movements make those changes. And it's kind of like when I was telling the story about the lead poisoning, you know, those public health people don't give credit to those high school students on the West Side for discovering the issue of lead poisoning. So we in the movements have to know that we did it, because they're not going to tell us. So we need to, and that part of that fuels our hope. It helps us to see that the actions of ordinary people, unrecorded in the history books, but are the motor for much of the change that we actually do succeed in having.
And I'm going to have to let that be the last word. On a hopeful note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panelists.
That's great.
For wonderful.
That was wonderful.
And thank the IOP.
Your last intervention
Susan,
was
for
wonderful.
doing such a lovely job moderating. I also want to let you all know, to remind you that Bernie Kleine's photographs will be on exhibit at the Center for Identity and Inclusion at 5710 Woodlawn until the end of next week, and they are not to be missed. And also the book that Mary Lou edited on the Chicago Freedom Movement will be for sale out in the lobby. And thank you all for coming, and thank you. And Don wrote an article, Sherry Bevel wrote an article. Thank you, Prexy, thank you, Mary Lou, thank you, Don. Thank you, Brenetta, and thank you, Susan, for an incredible evening.